The contract was 7 pages long, written in a clerk's faultless copperplate upon heavy cream-laid paper. Helena Ainsworth read it for the 3rd time, her fingers resting on the polished surface of her late father's desk. The solicitor, Mr. Hemlock, a man whose disposition was as dry and rustling as his name, coughed delicately from the other side of the room. He had already voiced his considerable reservations. Each clause was a brick in the wall of her new life. There was the settlement of her father's debts, a sum that had stolen the breath from her lungs when Mr. Hemlock had first revealed it. There was the provision of a generous pin money allowance, the stewardship of 2 minor properties, the rights of a Duchess of the realm, all laid out in precise, unsparing language. And then there was the final, peculiar codicil. Clause 27. The party of the first part, His Grace the Duke of Blackwood, shall not be held to the customary expectations of marital congress. The party of the second part, Miss Helena Ainsworth, shall accept that any physical intimacy, including that which may be required to secure a legitimate heir to the dukedom, shall be subject to the sole and absolute discretion of His Grace. It was a clause of profound coldness, not merely a legal provision, but a warning, a statement of profound and unassailable distance. Miss Ainsworth, Mr. Hemlock began again, his voice strained. It is not too late to enter into a union under such sterile terms. It is an affront to nature, to the very institution of marriage. Helena looked up from the page. Her own reflection was a pale oval in the dark gloss of the desk. She saw a young woman of 24, with hair the colour of dark honey, and eyes that had been called grey or green or hazel, depending on the light and the mood of their owner. Today, they were simply tired. "My father left me in a precarious position, Mr. Hemlock," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is the only viable solution that preserves not only my own security, but his name. But the man is— They call him the Winter Duke," the solicitor whispered, as though the name itself were a curse that might be invoked. "They say he is not whole, that a chill follows him, that his touch—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "These are society whispers, of course, but where there is smoke, Miss Ainsworth—" "I am not afraid of whispers," Helena said. She picked up the pen. It felt unnaturally heavy. "And I am not in a position to be afraid of the cold." The ink was black against the cream of the paper. Helena Ainsworth. Her name. The signature that would trade her identity for a title and solvency. The contract felt less like a marriage settlement, and more like the deed to a remote and frozen property she had just purchased. Sight unseen. She did not feel like a bride-to-be. She felt like an explorer, charting a course for the Arctic. The journey north to Northumberland was a descent into winter's heart. The carriage rattled over frozen ruts in the road, the world outside a stark etching of black branches against a low, white sky. London, with its noise and its press of humanity, felt a world away, a memory from another life. Here, there was only the wind, the vast, empty landscape, and the rhythmic plod of the horses' hooves. She was not met at the coaching inn by the Duke himself. A closed carriage, bearing a ducal crest on its door, was waiting for her, attended by a silent, grim-faced coachman. The chill, it seemed, began long before one reached the man himself. Frostfell Manor appeared as the weak afternoon light was beginning to fail. It did not rise from the landscape so much as command it. A sprawling Gothic edifice of dark grey stone that seemed to have absorbed all the colour from its surroundings. Its turrets and gables clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. No warm lights glowed in its many windows. It looked like a house holding its breath. The great front doors swung open as the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel. A line of servants stood in the cavernous entrance hall, headed by a severe-looking butler whose face seemed carved from granite. He introduced himself as Jennings. Behind him, a woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a tight bun and a surprisingly kind face watched Helena with an expression of intense, searching curiosity. "Welcome to Frostfell, Your Grace," Jennings said, his voice devoid of any inflection. The title sounded strange, a costume she had not yet learned how to wear. And then she saw him. He stood at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, half shrouded in the deep shadows of the upper gallery. The rumours had not done him justice. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate, severe black. His face was a study in aristocratic angles, all sharp lines and shadows, crowned with hair as black as a raven's wing. He was brutally handsome, like a figure from a tragic poem, and he was utterly still. He descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate. He did not look at the servants, or the hall, or the cold that seemed to radiate from the very stone walls. His eyes, a startling, pale grey, the colour of a winter sky before a storm, were fixed on her. He stopped 3 paces from her. The air between them felt charged, electric, cold. "Miss Ainsworth," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as controlled and remote as the rest of him. "Welcome." He did not offer his hand. He did not smile. He simply stood there, a monolith of contained stillness. He was wearing gloves, fine, black leather gloves that fit his hands perfectly. "Your Grace," Helena replied, inclining her head. She would not be the first to show weakness. She would not shiver, though the cold of the hall was seeping into her bones. "Jennings will have your things taken to your rooms," the Duke said, his gaze unwavering. "Dinner is at 8. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into a corridor that seemed to swallow the light. He had been in her presence for less than a minute, but the encounter left her feeling as though she had stood too close to a glacier. Mr. Hemlock was right. A chill did follow him. It was the defining feature of his existence. Her rooms were in the east wing, a suite of chambers that were undoubtedly luxurious. A large sitting room with a fireplace, a spacious bedchamber with a heavy curtained 4-poster, and a dressing room. But they were cold. So very cold. A small sullen fire sputtered in the grate, doing little to combat the pervasive chill that clung to the damask curtains and the dark, polished wood. Dust sheets covered half the furniture, pale ghosts in the gloom. A young maid, her face pinched and nervous, came to help her unpack. Her name was Rose. She curtsied so low her forehead nearly touched the floor and did not meet Helena's eyes. "If you require anything, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "A larger fire, perhaps," Helena suggested gently. The girl's eyes widened in something that looked like fear. "His Grace does not. He prefers a cooler house, Your Grace." "I see," Helena said. So the cold was a decree, an edict from the master of the house that all must endure. The housekeeper she had seen in the hall appeared a few moments later. She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable. Her expression was still searching, but there was a warmth in her gaze that was absent from everyone and everything else in this house. "Welcome, Your Grace," she said, her voice possessed of a surprising softness. "I hope your journey was not too arduous." "It was manageable. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Helena replied. "This is a formidable house." A flicker of something, sadness perhaps, crossed the housekeeper's face. It was not always so. It has been a long winter at Frostfell. She said it as if winter were a season of the soul, not merely of the calendar. "If there is anything I can do to make you more comfortable, you have only to ask." Her eyes darted towards the small fire, then back to Helena, a silent communication passing between them. Here, Helena sensed, was a potential ally, a keeper of the house's secrets and its sorrows. Dinner was an exercise in absurdity. The dining hall was a cavernous space, large enough to host a royal banquet. A single long refectory table stretched down its center, gleaming under the light of a distant chandelier. 2 places had been set, one at the head of the table for the Duke, one at the far, far end for her. The distance between them was a chasm, a vast expanse of polished mahogany and silence. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, was already seated when she arrived. He rose, a brief, formal acknowledgement of her presence, and then sat again. The meal was served by silent footmen, who moved like spectres around the perimeter of the room. The food was exquisite, but it was cold by the time it reached her. Every dish. They ate in complete silence. Helena was acutely aware of him, a dark, still figure at the other end of the world. He did not look at her. He seemed to be looking at nothing, his attention turned inward to some bleak, internal landscape. The only sounds were the faint clink of silver on porcelain, sounds that were swallowed by the immense, oppressive silence of the room. This was her marriage. A contract, a title, and a long, cold table. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a currency of diminishing returns. They changed nothing. Instead, a quiet resolve began to harden within her. She had made a bargain. She would keep her end of it. But she would not be frozen. She would not allow the chill of this house or its master to extinguish the small, steady flame of her own spirit. If she was to live in the Arctic, she would learn to build a fire. In his study, Alistair stood before the window, staring out at the black, skeletal trees of the park. The moon was a sliver of ice in the sky. He could feel the echo of her presence in the house. A disturbance, a change in the managed, frozen equilibrium of his world. He had watched her at dinner. A small, composed figure at the far end of the table. She had not fidgeted. She had not looked frightened or resentful, as he had expected. She had simply eaten her cold food with a quiet dignity that was, in its own way, unnerving. He flexed his gloved hands. The phantom chill was always there, a memory embedded in his nerve endings. The memory of slick, freezing water, of a woolen coat heavy with it, of a hand growing colder and colder in his own, until it was no longer the hand of his brother, but a piece of ice. Julian. 5 years. It felt like a century. It felt like yesterday. The world had shrunk since that day. It had become this house, this study, the safe, contained silence where he could manage the cold. He had needed a wife. The title demanded an heir. The estate, vast and complex, needed a duchess to oversee its domestic machinery, a role his grief made him incapable of filling. The marriage contract was a business transaction, designed to acquire a necessary component for his life, while keeping the core of it, the frozen, damaged part, untouched. He had chosen her for her quietness, her lack of powerful connections, her seeming pliability. He had assumed she would be like the others, the maids, the footmen, the tenants, cowed by his silence, keeping a respectful, fearful distance. But as he watched her, across that vast, empty table, he had seen something else. Not fear, not defiance, something stiller, something that looked unnervingly like strength. He had built the walls of Frostfell high and thick. He had filled its rooms with a silence as deep as a frozen lake. He had done everything in his power to create a world where nothing could touch him. And now, she was here, inside the walls, a stranger at his table, a quiet, steady presence that he could not, for the life of him, understand. He felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years. Not warmth, not hope, something far more dangerous. Curiosity. The first week passed in a state of suspended animation. Helena learned the rhythms of the house, the silent breakfasts, the solitary lunches, the long cold dinners. She saw the Duke only at these meals, and occasionally as a fleeting, dark figure crossing a distant hall. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and formal. She began to explore. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, drawing rooms where furniture huddled under dust sheets like sleeping animals, a ballroom where the chandeliers were shrouded in canvas, its floor filmed with dust, a music room with a pianoforte that was painfully out of tune. It was a house in mourning, grieving for a life it no longer possessed. Her campaign began not with a grand assault, but with small, quiet acts of reclamation. One morning, she found Jennings in the main hall. "Jennings," she said, her tone pleasant but firm. "I find the dining arrangements rather impractical. Please have the small table from the breakfast parlour moved into the dining hall, and we shall use that for our meals henceforth." The butler's eyebrows, which seemed to be permanently fixed in a line of dour disapproval, rose a fraction of an inch. His Grace prefers not to have his soup served cold, I imagine," Helena interrupted smoothly. "And neither do I. The small table, Jennings. For luncheon." She did not wait for an answer, but continued on her way. She could feel his astonished gaze on her back. That afternoon, she entered the dining hall to find the small, circular table set for two. The vast refectory table had been pushed against the far wall. The room immediately felt less like a mausoleum. When the Duke arrived, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the change. He looked from the small table to Helena, who was already seated. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his pale eyes. He said nothing. He simply took his seat opposite her. The space between them was no longer a chasm. It was merely a table. Her next project was the fires. She found Mrs. Gable in the linen closet, a place that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. "Mrs. Gable," she began, "the house is cold." The housekeeper sighed, a soft, weary sound. "Yes, Your Grace, it is. I want larger fires laid in all the main rooms, and in my suite. I want them kept burning from morning until night." Mrs. Gable's hands stilled over the stack of sheets she was folding. "His Grace is the master of this house, I know," Helena said, "but I am its mistress, and I am cold. Please see to it." Mrs. Gable looked at her, truly looked at her, and a small, slow smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was the first genuine smile Helena had seen since she arrived. "At once, Your Grace." That evening, when Alistair entered the drawing-room before dinner, He found it transformed. A large, cheerful fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. The dust sheets had been removed from the sofas and chairs, and a vase of winter hellebores, which Helena had discovered in a sheltered part of the garden, sat on a small table. The room was not just warmer. It felt alive. He stopped, his gloved hand resting on the doorframe. Helena was seated by the fire, reading a book. She looked up as he entered. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, as if nothing were amiss. He did not reply. He walked to the fireplace and stood before it, his back to her, staring into the flames. He stood there for a long time. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Helena did not speak. She simply waited. "It is warmer?" he said finally, his voice low. "Yes," she replied. "It is." He did not object. He did not order the fires extinguished. He simply accepted it. It was a small victory, but it felt momentous. Her greatest discovery was the library. It was on the ground floor, at the back of the house, a vast 2-story room lined from floor to ceiling with books. A gallery ran around the upper level, accessed by a spiral staircase of wrought iron. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt lived in. The fire in its enormous hearth was always lit. The books were not covered in dust. A large, leather-topped desk stood before the tall windows, its surface orderly, but clearly in use. This was his sanctuary, the heart of his frozen kingdom. She began to spend her afternoons there. She did not intrude on his space. She would select a book from the shelves, histories, poetry, classical texts, and settle in a wingback chair by the fire, far from his desk. He was often there when she arrived, bent over ledgers or correspondence. At first, her presence seemed to agitate him. He would grow even stiller, the line of his shoulders tightening. But she was quiet. She did not speak to him or demand his attention. She simply existed in the same space, a silent, unobtrusive presence. After a few days, the tension began to ease. He seemed to accept her presence as a new permanent feature of the room, like a piece of furniture. They would spend hours in the library together, wrapped in a companionable silence, the only sounds the rustle of a turning page and the soft crackle of the fire. It was the closest they had come to intimacy, this shared silence in a room full of words. One afternoon, she was searching for a volume of Petrarch's sonnets on a high shelf. She found it, but as she reached for it, she dislodged the book next to it. It fell, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Before she could move, he was there. He had crossed the room with a swift, silent grace she had not seen in him before. He bent and picked up the book. "Thank you," she said, reaching for it. He held it for a moment, his gaze on the cover. Then he extended it to her. As she took it, her fingers brushed against his gloved hand. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. He recoiled as if he had been burned, snatching his hand back. The book fell from his grasp, landing at her feet. He stared at his own hand, his breath catching in his throat, a look of raw panic in his eyes. It was the first unguarded expression she had seen on his face. It was not anger. It was fear. Helena did not react. She did not gasp or ask what was wrong. She simply bent down, picked up the book for a second time, and placed it on the small table beside her chair. "My apologies," she said calmly, her voice even. "I am clumsy today." She turned back to the bookshelf, pretending to search for another volume. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him standing there, frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of confusion and shock. He had expected a reaction. Fear, perhaps, or revulsion. Her quiet, deliberate lack of one had wrong-footed him completely. He turned without another word and strode back to his desk. But he did not sit down. He stood with his back to her, one hand gripping the back of his chair, his knuckles white even through the leather. Helena returned to her seat by the fire, her heart beating a little faster than she would have liked. She had not been afraid. But she had felt it. Through the fine leather of his glove, she had felt a coldness that was not of the room, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to come from the man himself. It was not just a reputation. It was real. A week later, a carriage bearing a familiar, ostentatious crest rolled up the drive. Lady Isabel Vance had arrived. She swept into the drawing room, a whirlwind of emerald silk and expensive perfume. She was flawlessly beautiful, with blonde hair arranged in an elaborate coronet, and eyes the color of a summer sky. Her smile was dazzling. It did not reach her eyes. "My dear Duchess," she exclaimed, her voice carrying through the room like a bell. She rushed forward and embraced Helena, a brief cold press of silk and bone. "Or should I call you Helena? We must be friends. I have been simply dying to come and welcome you to our quiet little corner of the world." Helena endured the embrace. "Lady Vance, how kind of you to call." "Oh, nonsense. It is my duty. Alistair and I are such very old friends," she said, her eyes flicking around the room, taking in the roaring fire, the polished furniture, the vase of flowers. A small, tight smile played on her lips. My, you have been busy. The old place hasn't looked so warm in years." The word warm was spoken with a delicate, almost imperceptible sneer. The Duke entered the room then, Isabel's face lit up with a brilliant, possessive smile. "Alistair, darling," she cried, turning towards him. She glided across the room and placed a hand on his arm. Helena saw him flinch, a tiny, almost invisible tightening of his entire body. He did not pull away, but he stood utterly rigid. "Isabel," he said, his voice flat. "This is an unexpected visit." "I came to welcome your bride," she said, her hand still resting on his arm. "She is quite charming, though I confess I am surprised. I had thought you would prefer someone more accustomed to our ways." "Helena is the Duchess of Blackwood," Alistair said, his voice taking on an edge of ice. "She is perfectly accustomed to her own house." He gently, but pointedly, disengaged his arm from her grasp. Isabel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, turning her bright, false gaze back to Helena. "Of course. I only meant... Well, Frostfell has its own particular climate," she said, her eyes glinting with malice. "I do hope you have a strong constitution, my dear. Not everyone is suited to such a bracing environment." It was a declaration of war, delivered with the sweet smile of a trusted friend. Helena met her gaze, her own expression calm and unreadable. "My constitution is quite robust, thank you, Lady Vance," she said, "and I find I am growing rather fond of the cold." The almost smile that touched Alistair's lips was so fleeting, so minuscule, that if Helena had not been watching him so closely, she would have missed it entirely. But it was there, a tiny upward quirk at the corner of his mouth, the first sign of a thaw in the long, hard winter of his face. And it had made all the difference. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The departure of Lady Vance left a lingering chill in the air that even the roaring fires could not entirely dispel. Her visit had been a performance of pleasantry, but her intent had been as sharp and clear as a shard of ice. She had come to assess, to probe for weakness, and to remind Helena of her place as an outsider. In the days that followed, Helena redoubled her quiet efforts. She did not see it as a battle against Isabel Vance, but as a campaign for life within the walls of Frostfell. She spent a morning with Mrs. Gable, going through the household accounts, her sharp mind quickly grasping the complexities of running an estate of such magnitude. The housekeeper, initially reserved, began to open up. Her conversation sprinkled with anecdotes about the house in the old days. The Dowager Duchess, His Grace's mother, she loved this place, Mrs. Gable said, her hands busy polishing a silver teapot. There were balls in the winter and garden parties in the summer. The house was always full of laughter, especially when the boys were young. She fell silent, her expression clouding over. Helena knew she was referring to Alistair and his brother. Mr. Julian was the sunshine in this house, Mrs. Gable continued, her voice soft with memory, full of life and mischief. He was the image of his mother, His Grace. He was always the quieter one, the responsible one, but he adored his brother. They were inseparable. Helena listened, piecing together the fragments of the past. The house was not just cold, it was haunted by the ghost of a lost warmth, a lost laughter. She began to take long walks on the grounds, wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak. The park was beautiful in its stark winter way. Ancient oaks stood like grim sentinels, their branches bare. The ground was hard with frost. She discovered a walled garden. Its gate rusted shut. Inside, everything was overgrown and neglected, a tangle of dead roses and skeletal climbing vines. A project for the spring, she thought. She learned the geography of the estate's sorrow. There was a particular path she saw the Duke walk sometimes, a winding track that led through a dark copse of pines. And there was the lake, a vast grey sheet of water at the northern edge of the property. No one ever went there. The paths leading to it were overgrown. She felt a palpable sense of dread emanating from it, a silent, sorrowful warning. Alistair watched her. From his study window, he saw her walking the grounds, a solitary figure in grey against the white landscape. He saw the lights she had ordered lit, pushing back the gloom in the long corridors. He heard the faint, clear notes of the pianoforte in the music room. She had found the tuner's name in the ledgers and summoned him from the village. The instrument was still not perfect, but it was no longer a discordant ruin. It was the sound of something being mended. He did not understand her. Any other woman would have fled back to London, or dissolved into hysterics, or battered herself against his silence. She did none of those things. She simply moved through his frozen world with a quiet, purposeful grace, bringing warmth and order not by demand, but by her very presence. She was like a determined gardener tending a frost-bitten landscape, convinced that life still existed beneath the frozen surface. His own life began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. He found himself lingering in the drawing room after dinner, listening to her play the piano. He found himself looking forward to their silent hours in the library. He began to speak to her more, his words no longer confined to the barest of necessities. "That piece is by Scarlatti," he said one evening, as she finished playing. Helena turned on the piano stool, surprised. "Yes. Do you play, Your Grace?" "I did, he said. "A long time ago." He looked at his gloved hands. "My brother was the musician in the family." It was the first time he had mentioned his brother to her. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Helena simply nodded, accepting the confidence without trying to pry it open. "He had excellent taste," she said softly, and turned back to the keys, playing a gentle nocturne that seemed to fill the silence with a quiet sense of peace. The thaw, when it came, was precipitated not by an act of kindness within the house, but by a crisis without. A message arrived one morning, delivered by a frantic-looking stable boy. One of the tenant farmers, a man named Croft, had a child who had been taken gravely ill with a fever. The village doctor was away in Newcastle, not expected back for 2 days. Helena did not hesitate. Her own mother had been skilled in the use of herbs and simple remedies, and she had passed much of that practical knowledge on to her daughter. "Have the gig brought round?" she told Jennings. "And ask Mrs. Gable to pack a basket with linens, broth, and any feverfew we have in the stores." "Your Grace," Jennings protested, his face a mask of horror. "It is not appropriate for you to go to a tenant cottage. The child may have something contagious." "And he may die if he receives no care," Helena countered, her voice sharp with an authority that silenced him. "I am going, Jennings." The Croft cottage was small and poor, but spotlessly clean. The air inside was thick with the scent of sickness and fear. A young woman, Mrs. Croft, her face pale with exhaustion, led Helena to a small cot where a little boy of about 5 lay tossing and turning, his skin flushed and hot to the touch. Helena set to work. She spoke in low, soothing tones to the mother, her calm presence a balm to the woman's panic. She bathed the child's face with cool water and gently coaxed a few sips of a fever-reducing tea between his lips. She sat with him for hours, her hand resting on his forehead, her voice a soft murmur as she told him a story about a brave knight and a friendly dragon. She was so absorbed in her task that she did not hear the footsteps at the door. It was only when Mrs. Croft gasped and curtsied that Helena looked up. Alistair stood in the doorway. He was dressed for riding, his tall frame filling the small space. His face was unreadable, his pale eyes fixed on the scene before him. His wife, the Duchess, kneeling on the stone floor of a tenant cottage, her sleeve rolled up, her hair coming loose from its pins, murmuring to a sick child. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching. He saw the genuine, unforced tenderness in her touch. He saw the way the child, even in his fevered state, seemed to lean into her presence. He saw a warmth, a compassion, that he had believed to be an illusion, a polite fiction people performed. Here, in this humble cottage, it was real. It was as real as the heat from the small fire, as real as the scent of the herbal tea. He watched for a long time. Then, without a word, he turned and left. Helena stayed until the child's fever broke, late in the afternoon. He fell into a peaceful, natural sleep, his breathing evening out. Mrs. Croft wept with relief, clinging to Helena's hand. "God bless you, Your Grace," she sobbed. "You saved him. You saved our boy." "He's a strong boy," Helena said gently. "He saved himself. Just get him to take the doctor's medicine when he returns." When she returned to Frostfell, weary but content, she found the Duke waiting for her in the entrance hall. "The boy?" he asked, his voice rough. "The fever has broken." "He's sleeping," she replied. He nodded, his gaze searching her face. "You were not afraid." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Fear would not have helped him, she said simply. He continued to look at her, a strange, intense expression in his eyes. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, a person separate from the contract and the title, a woman who walked into a sick room without fear, who brought comfort with her own 2 hands. "You should rest," he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You have had a long day." That night, a letter arrived, delivered by a special messenger from London. It was from Lady Isabel Vance. Helena found it placed on the hall table, her name written on the envelope in an elegant, sloping script. She opened it with a sense of foreboding. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a symphony of feigned concern. "My dearest Helena," it began, "I have heard the most alarming rumor, which I am sure cannot be true. It is being said in town that you have taken to visiting the sick in the village, like some common country nurse. My dear, you must know that this is simply not done. A duchess has a position to maintain. Such familiarity with the lower orders can only lead to a loss of respect. I'm sure you meant well, but your duty is to the dignity of the Blackwood name. Alistair is so sensitive to these things. I worry that your enthusiasms may cause him undue distress. Please, for your own sake, and for his, be more mindful of your station." Your concerned friend, Isabel Helena, read the letter twice. It was a vile, condescending piece of work, designed to undermine and intimidate. She felt a surge of cold anger. She was about to crumple it in her hand when she heard footsteps. Alistair had come out of the library. He saw the letter in her hand, the expression on her face. "Bad news?" he asked. Without thinking, she handed it to him. "From a concerned friend." He took it and read it. His face, already a mask of control, seemed to harden into granite. The silence in the hall stretched, taut and heavy. He read the letter through to the end, his expression unchanging. Then he looked up at her. "The dignity of the Blackwood name," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "was never more upheld than it was today, in a tenant cottage, by a woman who showed more true nobility in one afternoon than Lady Vance has shown in her entire life." He tore the letter in half, then in half again, the sound shockingly loud in the silent hall. He dropped the pieces onto the silver salver on the table. "You will not be troubled by her again," he said. It was a promise. He looked at Helena, and for the second time she saw it. The almost smile. It was more defined this time, a definite softening at the corner of his mouth, a light in his pale winter eyes. It was a look of respect, of approval, of alliance. In that moment, standing in the cold hall of Frostfell, with the pieces of Isabel's spiteful letter lying between them, Helena felt the first true shift in the foundations of their strange marriage. They were no longer just 2 strangers bound by a contract. They were 2 people standing on the same side of a line, and he had been the one to draw it. The incident with the letter marked a turning point. Alistair did not become a warm or effusive man overnight. The frost of 5 years was too deep for that. But the wall of impenetrable silence between them had been breached. He began to seek out her company. He would join her for her walks in the garden, pacing silently beside her, the crunch of his boots on the gravel, a steady rhythm next to the softer tread of her own. He would ask her opinion on matters of the estate, listening intently to her practical, well-reasoned replies. The house continued to change around them, Under Helena's direction, the shrouded furniture was uncovered, the rooms aired out, the tarnished silver polished until it shone. Flowers, forced in the estate's hothouses, appeared in every room. Colour and life were seeping back into the grey stones of Frostfell. The staff, too, began to thaw. The maids would smile at her. The footmen would meet her eyes. They were no longer the servants of a ghost, but of a living, breathing house. One evening, as she sat reading in the library, Alistair approached her chair. He was holding a thin, leather-bound volume. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, extending it to her. It was a collection of poems by a little-known Italian poet she had once mentioned in passing. "You remembered," she said, her voice soft with surprise. "I remember everything," he said. And the way he said it, it sounded less like a boast and more like a curse. She took the book, their fingers brushing for a second longer than was strictly necessary. He did not pull away this time. He held his position, though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in his gloved hand. He was fighting his own demons, battling a reflex that had ruled him for 5 years. "Thank you, Alistair," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on her tongue. He looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if acknowledging a treaty that had just been signed. Then he turned and went back to his desk. The spring, when it finally arrived, felt like a miracle. The hard, frozen ground softened. The stark black branches of the trees grew a faint green haze. Crocuses and daffodils pushed their way through the earth in the long neglected gardens. The world was coming back to life, and the change was reflected in the house. Helena had the great windows thrown open, letting the fresh, clean air sweep through the corridors, chasing out the last of the stale winter gloom. Her victory, however, had not gone unnoticed. Lady Isabel Vance, stung by Alistair's rejection and enraged by Helena's quiet success, decided on one last, desperate gambit. She would not attack Helena directly again. She would attack the Duke, using his own wound as a weapon, and she would do it in a way he could not escape. She arranged a small, impromptu dinner party at the home of a neighbouring baron, a man known for his love of gossip. She ensured both Alistair and Helena were invited, phrasing the invitation in such a way that to refuse would cause significant offence. With a heavy sense of foreboding, Alistair accepted. The evening was an ordeal. The room was filled with the cream of local society, their eyes all fixed on the Winter Duke and his new, unknown Duchess. Isabel was in her element, flitting from group to group, her laughter bright and brittle. She treated Helena with a cloying sweetness that was more insulting than open hostility. The moment she had engineered came after dinner, when the ladies and gentlemen had reconvened in the drawing-room. A servant entered, carrying a long, flat box wrapped in silk paper. "A gift has arrived for His Grace the Duke," the Baron announced, clearly in on the scheme. Isabel stepped forward, her face a mask of loving concern. "It is just a little something from me, Alistair," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I had them specially made in London. I know how you suffer with the cold." She took the box and presented it to him. He took it, his face impassive. He unwrapped the paper slowly, his movements deliberate. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a pair of exquisite riding gloves, made from the finest, softest calf skin, lined with sable A collective, indrawn breath seemed to pass through the room. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty, a public branding. It was not a gift. It was a reminder of his affliction, a beautifully wrapped insult designed to humiliate him, and to show Helena that she was married to a broken man. Alistair stared down at the gloves, his face pale, his body rigid. He was frozen, trapped in the spotlight of 24 pairs of pitying, curious eyes. He was back on the edge of the frozen lake, helpless and cold. Helena felt a surge of white-hot fury. She saw the triumphant, malicious glint in Isabel's eyes. She saw the shock and pity on the faces of the other guests. And she saw Alistair, alone and exposed. She moved. She walked to his side and placed a light hand on his arm. Then she looked at Isabel, her expression one of polite, unruffled calm. "How very thoughtful of you, Lady Vance," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They are beautiful." She reached down and took the box from Alistair's unresisting hands. She held it for a moment, then turned to Isabel with a serene smile. "But he has no need of them," she said. "I have found the house is quite warm enough now. In fact, he so rarely wears gloves at home anymore." She closed the lid of the box with a soft, definitive click. She did not return it to Isabel. She simply turned and placed it on a nearby table, next to a vase of flowers, as if it were an object of no importance whatsoever. A dismissal. A stunned silence fell over the room. Helena had not raised her voice. She had not created a scene. She had simply taken Isabel's weapon and disarmed it with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She had not denied the Duke's affliction. She had simply rendered it irrelevant. She had stood with him publicly and unequivocally. Isabel's face, for the first time, lost its perfect composure. A flush of angry red crept up her neck. She had been outmaneuvered, her cruelty exposed, and made to look cheap and vulgar. She had lost. Alistair looked at Helena. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. The ice in his eyes had shattered, and in its place was a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. It was gratitude. It was wonder. It was the look of a man who had been drowning and had just been thrown a lifeline. He offered her his arm. His bare, ungloved hand rested near hers. "Helena," he said, his voice low and firm for all to hear. "I believe it is time we went home." The carriage ride back to Frostfell was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a fragile, humming tension. Alistair sat opposite her, his hands resting on his knees. He was no longer wearing his gloves. He had left them on the table next to Isabel's spiteful gift. When they arrived, he did not go to his study. He followed her to the library. The fire was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He stood in the center of the room, his back to the fire, a dark, troubled silhouette. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why did you do that?" "Because it was a cruel thing to do," Helena said simply, untying the ribbons of her cloak. "And because it was a lie?" "A lie?" He looked confused. "I am what she said I am. Cold. Broken." "You are a man who is grieving," Helena corrected him gently. "That is not the same thing. Cruelty is a choice. Grief is a wound." He stared at her, the turmoil in his eyes painful to see. He paced the room, his movements agitated, the careful control he maintained at all times finally beginning to fray. "You are not afraid of me," he said, stopping before her. "Everyone else is. They have been for 5 years. They shrink away. They look at me with pity, with fear. But you You look at me as if I am just a man. You are just a man, Alistair, she said softly. No. The word was torn from him, a cry of long-suppressed anguish. That day on the ice, I became something else. A monster. A thing of winter. And then it came. The story. The truth he had locked away behind a wall of ice. He told her everything, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of pain. He told her about Julian, his bright, laughing, reckless younger brother. He told her about the dare, the race across the newly frozen lake. He told her about the terrible, cracking sound, the scream, the black, churning water. I got to him, he whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes fixed on a point in the past only he could see. I pulled him halfway onto the ice, but it was too thin. I couldn't get him all the way out. I just held him. He held out his hands, his bare, trembling hands. I held him as he grew cold. I felt the life, the warmth, seeping out of him into the water, into the ice. I felt it leave him, and I felt the cold take its place. It came into me, through my hands, through my arms. It settled in my bones. He dropped his hands to his sides, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Ever since that day, that is all I can feel when I touch someone. The cold. His cold. I see his face. I am back on the ice. Every single time. The confession hung in the air of the silent library, a thing of terrible, heart-breaking weight. It was not a curse. It was not madness. It was trauma, so profound and so deep that it had reshaped his entire sensory world. His affliction was a prison built of memory and grief. Helena stood before him, her heart aching with a compassion so fierce it almost stole her breath. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She did not tell him it wasn't his fault. The wound was too deep for such simple salves. She simply witnessed his pain. She let his confession fill the space between them, giving it the dignity of being heard without judgment. Then, when the terrible silence had stretched for what felt like an eternity, she did the one thing she knew she had to do. The one thing that might make a difference. She closed the small distance between them. She looked into his haunted winter-grey eyes. And she reached out her own bare hand and gently, deliberately took his. He flinched violently, a full-body tremor, his eyes shutting tight as if against a blow. He was bracing himself for the phantom cold, for the memory of the ice, for the face of his dying brother. But it did not come. Instead, there was only the firm, steady warmth of her skin against his. A simple, human warmth. It was not a fire. It was not a cure. It was just warmth. A quiet, persistent reality that stood in defiance of the ghost in his mind. He opened his eyes slowly. He looked down at their joined hands, her slender fingers wrapped around his. His large, cold hand he held in hers. He turned his hand over, his fingers curling to grip hers, a desperate, searching touch. "It's warm," he whispered, his voice filled with a profound, shattering disbelief. He looked up at her, his face naked with vulnerability. For the first time in 5 years, the chill in his bones had met something it could not extinguish. He did not weep. The Duke of Blackwood was not a man who wept. But a single, hot tear escaped his tightly controlled composure and traced a slow path down his cheek. It was a crack in the ice, a sign of the thaw, and in the quiet, fire-lit library of Frostfell, under the gentle, unwavering gaze of his wife, the long winter of Alistair St. John finally began to end. The house felt different the next morning. It was not something you could name or point to, but it was there, a lightness in the air, a sense of a long-held breath finally being released. When Alistair came down to breakfast, Helena was already there, pouring tea. He was not wearing gloves. He sat opposite her at the small table, and the first thing he did was reach across and take the small vase of snowdrops from the center, moving it slightly to the side, as if to clear the view between them. It was a small gesture, but it felt as significant as the signing of a treaty. "Good morning, Helena," he said. His voice was quiet, but the raw, broken edge from the night before was gone. "Good morning, Alistair," she replied, her smile soft and genuine. The staff noticed immediately. Jennings, entering with a platter of toast, stopped for a fraction of a second, his gaze fixed on the Duke's bare hands resting on the white linen tablecloth. Mrs. Gable, who came in to consult with Helena about the menus for the week, saw it too. A slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. The news would be all through the household by noon. The frost was breaking at Frostfell. The days that followed were a time of quiet discovery. Alistair seemed to be relearning the world through his senses. He would pick up a book in the library and run his bare fingers over the leather binding. He would stand in the garden and let the pale spring sun fall on his hands. He did not initiate touch with Helena often, but when he did, it was with a sense of tentative wonder. A light touch on her arm to draw her attention to a bird in a tree, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a cup of tea. Each small contact was a step out of the past, a step into the present. He was not a different man. The grief for his brother was still a part of him, a deep, quiet sorrow that would likely never fade entirely. But it was no longer a crushing, all-consuming force. It was becoming a scar, a part of his history, not the entirety of his existence. He began to talk about Julian, not with the agonized pain of his confession, but with a quiet, reminiscent sadness. He told Helena stories of their boyhood, of Julian's terrible singing voice, and his uncanny ability to charm his way out of any trouble. He was reclaiming the memory of his brother from the ice. A letter arrived from London a week later. It was not from Isabel Vance. It was from the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, Alistair's grandmother, a formidable old woman whose opinion ruled the ton. "My dearest Alistair," it read in a spidery but firm hand. "I have heard the most wonderful news. It is said that spring has finally come to Northumberland. I have decided it is high time I came to see it for myself. I have also heard that your new Duchess is a woman of sense and character, a commodity rarer than diamonds in this city. I am most eager to make her acquaintance. Expect me in a fortnight. Your loving grandmother, Augusta Blackwood Alistair, passed the letter to Helena." "This is her seal of approval," he said. "Once my grandmother has declared you a woman of sense and character, society has no choice but to agree." Isabel Vance's last desperate gambit had failed. Her attempt to paint Helena as a madwoman and Alistair as a hopeless case had been swept aside by the Dowager's pronouncement. Isabel, Helena later heard through a letter from a London acquaintance, had found the social climate suddenly chilly. Her cruelty had been exposed, and society, which prized discretion above all else, had turned its back on her. Her defeat was not a dramatic downfall, but a quiet, sad fading into obscurity. One bright, clear afternoon, Alistair asked Helena to walk with him. He led her not along their usual path in the garden, but north, towards the part of the estate she had instinctively avoided. He led her towards the lake. The path was overgrown, but he pushed aside the branches for her. They emerged into a clearing at the water's edge. The lake was a vast expanse of deep blue, sparkling in the spring sunlight. The ice was a distant memory. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and new leaves. They stood in silence for a long time, looking out over the water. "This is where it happened," Alistair said, his voice quiet. He was not looking at the lake as it was now, but as it was in his memory. Helena did not speak. She simply stood beside him, her presence a solid, comforting anchor in the shifting tides of his past. "For 5 years, I have seen nothing but ice here," he continued, his gaze slowly coming back to the present. "But today I see the water. I see the sky reflected in it. It is beautiful." He turned to her, a faint, wondering smile on his lips. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was warm. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "everyone will say you cured me, that you came here and worked some miracle. They will not understand." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her, his pale eyes clear and direct. "You did not cure me, Helena. You did not fix me. You simply stood in the cold with me, until I could remember the way back to the warmth. You saw a man, not a monster. And you were not afraid." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, of gratitude so deep it needed no words. "I entered into this marriage as a contract," he said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "A cold, practical arrangement. But it is no longer a contract to me, Helena. I hope that one day you might feel the same." Helena looked up at him, at this man she had married, this stranger who was no longer a stranger. She saw the lingering sadness in his eyes, but she also saw hope and strength and a love that was just beginning to find its voice. "Alistair," she said softly, her own hand tightening on his, "I already do." Epilogue. 1 year later. The gardens of Frostfell were in full, glorious bloom. The walled garden, which had been a forgotten tangle of thorns, was now a riot of colour and scent. Roses climbed the ancient brick walls, and the air was alive with the drowsy hum of bees. The great house stood with its windows thrown wide to the summer breeze, filled with sunlight and the sound of laughter. Helena, Duchess of Blackwood, stood on the terrace, a glass of lemonade in her hand, watching the guests mill about on the lawn. They were hosting their first garden party, a small, informal affair for their closest neighbours and friends. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman with eyes as sharp and intelligent as Alistair's, sat in a shaded chair, holding court like a queen on her throne. She saw Alistair moving through the crowd. He was laughing at something the local vicar had said, his hand resting briefly on the man's shoulder. He wore his title with an easy grace now, the stiffness gone from his shoulders. He was dressed in a coat of dark blue, not black, and his hands, his bare hands, were animated as he spoke. He was not a different man. The quiet, thoughtful core of him remained. But he was a whole man. The Winter Duke was a ghost, a story whispered about in London drawing rooms, a legend that had little to do with the man standing in the sunlit garden. He caught her eye across the lawn. The smile he gave her was just for her, a private, intimate thing that made her heart ache with a quiet, profound joy. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way towards her, his long strides purposeful. "Is our hostess hiding from her guests?" he asked, his voice a low murmur in her ear. I am admiring the view, she replied, leaning back against him as he came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. The roses have done well this year, he said, his chin resting on her shoulder. His hands, warm and firm, covered hers. They simply needed a little attention, she said. He was silent for a moment, his gaze on the garden she had brought back to life. As did we all, he said softly. They stood like that for a long time, a comfortable, companionable silence falling between them. Two people who had found their way to each other through a long and bitter winter. The past was not erased. The sorrow for a lost brother was a quiet note that would always play beneath the melody of their life. But it was no longer a prison. It was simply a part of their story, a story that had begun with a cold contract and a frozen heart, and had ended here, in the warmth of a summer afternoon, in a garden coming back to life. The chill was gone, the house was warm, and they were home. Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.